I'm so honored to be included in this lecture series, and I want to thank Elisa and everyone in the program for inviting me. Today I'm going to speak specifically about some of the work I've been doing and have done in Argentina, relating to the ways that the violence in that country has been processed and it continues to be processed. But to do that, I think I need to give a little bit of background information to make sure that we all know a little bit about what exactly that violence entailed. Well, from 1976 to 1983, the people of Argentina lived under one of the most repressive and violent military dictatorships of the 20th century. Over this 7-year period, the right-wing military junta that seized power in March of 1976 carried out its process of national reorganization, which was more colloquially known as El Proceso. And this sought to eliminate everyone deemed to be a subversive leftist element across the country. This effort led to the torture, death, and disappearance of as many as 30,000 Argentinian citizens who were kidnapped by the military police and taken to clandestine detention centers spread all across the country. When the families of these victims went to the state to find out what happened to their relatives, they would discover that in many cases all evidence of their family members' lives had been completely erased. The government acted as if these desaparecidos, or disappeared persons, had never existed to begin with. So I was invited here today, and Elisa asked me to speak about some of my work in Argentina relating to its last military dictatorship. This is a period which some people call a dirty war. Others refer to it as a politicide, and others, including myself, talk about it as a genocide. And I'll talk more about why. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with this one essential concept in genocide studies, which is this understanding that genocides are not events, not just the mass killing of large numbers of people, but instead genocides are long social and political processes that begin with much smaller steps within which victim groups are constructed and ostracized in a way that gradually and incrementally constructs a world in which mass killing can take place. What I hope to show today is that one of the reasons Argentina is such a fascinating case to me, and hopefully it will be to you, is that not only does it illustrate the reality that genocide doesn't just happen overnight, that it involves many stages over long periods of time, but it also demonstrates the fact that dealing with the enduring effects of that violence is an equally long and intensive process. And what for me is especially exciting about Argentina is the way that it shows how the process of coming to terms with a violent past is not always and only the responsibility of the state or of governmental actors. In the case of Argentina, it was really everyday citizens, what in academic or governmental parlance we call civil society, that has made the biggest difference and has had the most lasting impact in the way that Argentina has dealt with its genocidal past. So this is what I plan to do today with the presentation. First, I'm going to explain the steps that led up to the perpetration of genocide in Argentina. Second, break down the mechanisms of violence that were developed and implemented during that genocide. And third, and most importantly, where my research really focused, look at painting a picture of the inspiring and creative ways that Argentinian society, both with and without the support of the state, has addressed its own violent past to create a present and a future that is far less prone to repeat this painful violence. And before I go any further, I should really articulate one central idea to my thinking on these issues and also one caveat. I'll start with the caveat. As I said, I refer to the violence that occurred during Argentina's last military dictatorship as a genocide, but not everyone calls it a genocide. And indeed, if we only go by the definition in the UN Genocide Convention, it would not be considered a genocide because it was against political groups, and that is, of course, not one of the protected groups in this legal definition. However, I am not a lawyer, so I don't feel so beholden to this definition. I prefer a more expansive definition that one, includes political groups, but two, also acknowledges that genocide uses an array of mechanisms to perpetrate violence, and that those mechanisms are not only about physical destruction of groups, but also about the destruction of cultural and economic viability of groups. And that brings me to this central idea that I want to highlight before I delve into the specifics of Argentina. For me, the violence of genocide doesn't just have this physical force, but it also has a social and an affective or emotional force. And this social and emotional force is what allows for the physical destruction of groups to begin with, But for instance, we can think about the culture of European anti-Semitism that the Nazis took advantage of and cultivated in order to create an environment or a world in which the Holocaust could take place. But it also, that affective violence doesn't just disappear when the physical violence ends. For instance, when the Allied forces defeated the Germans in World War II and liberated the concentration and death camps, it's not as if anti-Semitism disappeared from Europe, right? There's still this enduring forms of social violence that have to be dealt with. And this social and affective force continues to perform and to resonate long into the future. So that's why I refer to this as resonant violence, this affective energy of large-scale genocidal violence that continues to resonate and perform within a genocidal society even after the physical violence comes to an end. And if this more obscure, less visible form of violence is not addressed and acknowledged, then it can continue to manifest in other forms of violence against victim groups, like enduring social inequality between groups, institutional discrimination against groups, or economic disparities among groups. And to understand what I'm talking about, we just need to think about the demographic differences between white Americans and black Americans or Native Americans in this country today, which I think is a definite example of how the violence of genocide or atrocity can continue long after the physical violence against these groups has ended. The good news, I think, is that this resonant violence, when it is recognized, can indeed be dealt with. It can in fact be transformed into new forms of power or political agency. And that, I argue, is exactly what happened and is happening in Argentina. But before we get into this more optimistic place, we should take a step backwards to look at the violence that preceded it. And to do that, we can't just start with the military dictatorship of 1976 to 1983. We have to look at the various factors that led to that dictatorship and that allowed for the large-scale perpetration of violence that would take place during that 7-year period. So, if you had been in Argentina at the beginning of the 20th century, you would have had no idea that it would become a country that several decades later would devolve into a society that could perpetrate the levels of violence it would see in the 1970s and 80s. Here you see some nice pictures of Buenos Aires, tango. Argentina at this period was a major site of European immigration. It was second only to New York as a place where European immigrants were coming in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By 1908, it was the 7th wealthiest developed nation in the world, and it's important to recognize that it was considered then a developed nation. Right now it's considered a developing nation. It's one of the only examples we have of a country devolving from a developed status to developing status. It was in the top 5 of world exports. It had a higher per capita income than Denmark, Canada, and the Netherlands, and it had higher literacy levels than most Latin American countries would reach even half a century later. So what happened? How did it go from being this vibrant society, the successful, economically and culturally successful society, into a place where this violence could be perpetrated? Well, several factors really contributed to creating that environment that would allow for this perpetration, and they really all started in 1929 with the world economic crisis and the Great Depression. This was when things began to start turning back in Argentina. This economic instability led to a series of coups d'etat. There were actually 5 other coups d'etat before the one that we're talking about today. 5 military coups d'etat. And each of these began to install increasingly aggressive forms of what Argentinian sociologist Guillermo O'Donnell calls bureaucratic authoritarian regimes. What are these regimes characterized by? Well, according to O'Donnell, these are regimes that it's a system of government that's controlled by and balanced toward an economic elite. There's a suppression of citizenship and exclusion of civil society from participating in public life. And these governments are directed towards privatization of economic and industry and the establishment of what they call economic order, but what we can really think of as neoliberalism. And I'll explain more exactly what I'm talking about with neoliberalism. These coups also led to increasing amounts of oppression and torture of political opponents and the beginnings of developing violent mechanisms for dealing with political opponents. And all of this is mixed with what Jim Waller would call a high authority orientation in Argentinian society that's represented most clearly through the main political movement in Argentina, Peronism, which is still a central political ideology in Argentina. It's hard to describe, but it's a bit of a mix between populism, but with a very strong central authoritarian figure, charismatic authority figure. And that was initially represented by Juan Domingo Perón. This rise of Peronism in Argentina led to the development of a disproportionately powerful executive, and that's a political model that still very much exists in Argentina today. So let's look at Perón and Peronism. Perón, democratically elected figure in 1946, not a dictator, he was democratically elected, but he did rise to popularity because of his role in the military government. If you don't know him, I'm sure you know his wife, Eva Perón, Evita, yes, from the musical, if nothing else. Madonna. She was extremely popular figure. She was especially popular with the working class, which she referred to as the descamisados, the shirtless ones. She and Perón really expanded workers' rights in Argentina. They extended the right to vote to women. Evita died of cancer in 1952 at the end of Perón's first term, but Perón was elected for a second term that same year. All throughout this period, Perón was very much disliked by the elites because of their favoring of the working class. So these elites were constantly working to remove him from power. And of course, the elites were in collusion with the military. And ultimately, they were successful. Perón was displaced in a coup in 1955, and this forced him into exile for 17 years. And during that 17-year period, Peronism was illegal. It was outlawed. Now, during that exile, though, we've got all of this other stuff happening in the world. For one, it's the Cold War, and the biggest thing that led to in Latin America, of course, is the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s. So the Cuban Revolution leads to a rise in these leftist guerrilla organizations across Latin America that are fighting for the rise of the left across the region. And those are represented in Argentina by these two groups. The Montoneros, which are a Peronist leftist organization, pro-Perón, and the Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, People's Revolutionary Army, which were an anti-Peronist leftist organization. So, both leftists, both for the rise of communism, one Peronist, one anti-Peronist. So it's very confusing. They are both fighting for the rise of the left and against military regimes, against neoliberal economics. So, after the fall of the 1966 to 73 dictatorship, Perón returns to Argentina, but it's a very different Perón. And that is represented most clearly when he arrives by plane at Ezeiza Airport. All of the Montoneros, the Peronist leftists, are at the airport to welcome him, and Perón orders an attack against them at Ezeiza Airport, leading to what's known now as the Ezeiza Massacre. So Perón is elected president again, but now he's really fighting against the left. Perón also comes back with a new wife, Maria Estela Martinez, who's known as Isabelita, Little Isabel, by the Argentinians. And they together, she's the vice president, and they together begin fighting the rise of these leftist groups quite aggressively. Now, Perón dies in 1974, only a year after he comes back, and when you've got such a popular authority figure, when he dies, there's this power vacuum that's left behind, and that's a big problem. Now, Isabelita becomes the president, and she tries to fill that power vacuum by going even harder against these political opponents. So she begins this Argentine anti-communist alliance, which begins the work of disappearing and torturing leftist elements in the country. So this is important to know that the disappearances actually began during a period of democracy, not during the dictatorship. But the army still felt like she wasn't doing a good enough job, and the army had the support of the U.S. So the U.S. Was involved in many of the military coups across Latin America at this time, and the U.S. gave them support, the army support, to have another coup d'etat in 1976, and this is on the 24th of March 1976. This is when the process of national reorganization begins. So what's this process? What does it entail? It is a process of completely eliminating political subversives, and this is, of course, the victim group deemed subversive by the perpetrators, right? And all leftists from the country. It's often referred to as a dirty war or the dirty war, but that's not really an acceptable term in Argentina because it was a term that was developed by the army to obscure the one-sided nature of the violence. Okay? They wanted to make it seem like it was a civil war, which in fact it was not. Now, the dictatorship was intricately connected with the introduction to neoliberal economics. So what are neoliberal economics? As Hirschberg and Rosen say, it's the opening of Latin America's economies to foreign investment and trade by way of privatization of public activity, deregulation of private activity, and production primarily for export and fiscal austerity. It's a completely open market with no regulations, or as few regulations as possible. So we can't think of the violence of the dictatorship without thinking of this economic regime that they're trying to install within the context of the Cold War, right, and the fight against communism. So what are the forms of oppression and repression did the military junta use to install this economic regime? Here you see on the left is Macera. He was the admiral of the Navy. On the right is Videla. He was the first president of the military junta, head of the army. They were really the masterminds behind the violence that was perpetrated. So they come into power. Congress is closed. All political parties and labor unions are banned. The Supreme Court is removed from office. All universities and media outlets are under their control, and there's a national curfew put in place of like 9 o'clock, which if any of you has been to Argentina, they don't even get up for a coffee at 9 o'clock. Dinner starts at 11, so this is really bad for them. But the violence of the dictatorship was also reflected in the most basic aspects of daily life. Diana Taylor says the physical semiology of the population changed because of this repressive regime. This is a flyer that was put out by the army, an educational flyer. It says, así sí, así no, like this, not like that, not like this. So you see, this is the way you're supposed to dress. That is not the way you're supposed to dress. Blue jeans were prohibited during this period. You couldn't wear colorful clothing. You had to look really properly and conservatively dressed, or you could be disappeared. You could be arrested for dressing the wrong way, for saying anything against the regime, for having the wrong book. For instance, if you were studying Marx at school or any sort of leftist author, that could be cause for disappearance. Or if you were associating with the wrong people, if you were caught talking to people in public spaces, that could be a cause for disappearance. All of this led to a phenomenon that Hannah Arendt refers to as the ubiquity of the informant. This idea that the person who informs on you could be anywhere, right? So your neighbor, that person you passed at the grocery store, any of them could tell the police that you were a leftist, a subversive, and then they could come in the middle of the day or in the middle of the night and take you off of the street, drive you away, and you would never be seen or heard from again. This is disappearance. This is the main technique of violence that was developed during this period. Oftentimes it would happen in broad daylight purposefully so that everyone could see that people were being disappeared, and it was a way of deterring resistance against the military regime. The term disappearance is especially apt because not only did the people, your family and the people left behind not know where you were, if they went to the state to ask what had happened to them, they would most often say that all records of your existing were gone. There's no evidence of your existence. You had literally disappeared, right? As Videla, the first president of the first military junta, said, "No están ni vivos ni muertos, están desaparecidos." They're neither alive nor dead. They are disappeared. It's this sort of liminal in-between place, both for the disappeared people, but also for the families of the disappeared. Yeah? So what we see is this inherently affective or emotional strategy that it's meant not only to affect the person being disappeared, but to destabilize and terrorize the entire country, because they, in fact, could be next. As Diana Taylor puts it, the military spectacle made people pull back in fear. Well, that's too much. I went too far. Denial and tacit complicity from the show of force. Therein lay its power. The military violence could have been relatively invisible, as the term disappearance suggests. The fact that it wasn't invisible indicates that the population as a whole was its intended target. So what would happen to the people who were disappeared? Well, you would be taken to one of around 500 clandestine detention or torture centers that were spread across the country. These range from private homes to police stations. The largest is called ESMA, and that was the former Navy training school, and I'll talk more about that later. Then once you arrived there, using techniques that the officers learned from United States School of the Americas, which is this training facility in Panama, where U.S. military and CIA officers taught the military regimes across Latin America how to torture people, to get information from them. They would use these techniques to torture, rape, and what they would call question the disappeared people, these prisoners. When they felt like what they were trying ultimately to do was get people to name names, right? They wanted to know other subversives, other people they could disappear. The prisoners were also forced to perform slave labor, most often creating false documents that the military would then use to support claims of what happened to the disappeared. Also, about 500 of the people who were disappeared were pregnant women at the time of their disappearance. And what would happen in those cases is they would wait until the women gave birth, then the women would be killed, and their babies were given to military families or families who were sympathetic with the military to raise as their own. And those kids would think that they were with their biological family. They would have no idea about their background. When the perpetrators had all of the information that they wanted from these people, what would they do to get rid of them? Well, the most common thing they did was the victims would be stripped naked, drugged and sedated, and then flown in these airplanes or helicopters in what were called death flights over the river next to Buenos Aires, and they would be thrown into the river. Why did they use this means of disposal? Well, the military was in collusion with the Catholic Church, and they went to the Catholic Church and said, what's the most moral way that we can get rid of, dispose of these people? And they said, well, you should drug them and throw them in the water because then technically you're not killing them. They're not able to swim, so it's their fault if they can't swim and save themselves. These bodies of these people are still being found today in the rivers. So, to this point, I've attempted to paint a bit of a picture to you of this physical, social, and affective violence of the dictatorship, and you've seen how the worst of these atrocities were preceded by this long line of contributing factors. What I want to focus on now, and this is really the predominant aspect of my own research, is the long journey of addressing that resonant violence of genocide. And as you'll see, this process in Argentina wasn't an easy one, and neither was it one that proceeded inevitably forward. It had lots of fits and starts, progressions and regressions. Indeed, the work of responding to past violence is not yet over in Argentina. It still preoccupies contemporary politics. But what's particularly fascinating about Argentina that makes it unlike some other genocides is that a number of groups emerged even within the period of the dictatorship to resist and respond to the horrific violence taking place around them. So we can think about the modes of resistance that started even while during the height of this violence. As much as the military junta tried to silence this ability of people to assume space in the public sphere and to speak out against the dictatorship, they didn't fully succeed. And several very important groups emerged to denounce the dictatorship publicly and to fight against it at great risk to themselves. The most famous of these are the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. This is a group of mothers whose children were disappeared. They met, actually, at the Ministry of the Interior in 1977 when they were filing claims to find out what happened to their children. And they started hearing each other's stories and understanding that they were all going through the same thing. So then they started meeting at each other's houses. But then on the 30th of April, 1937, so basically 1 year after the dictatorship began, 14 of these mothers met in the Plaza de Mayo, which is the main square in Buenos Aires. It's a symbolically significant site for a number of reasons. First, it's the site where the Declaration of Independence against Spain was issued after and bringing an end to the colonial period in Argentina. But it's also right in front of the presidential palace, the Casa Rosada, the pink house instead of the White House. It's also next to the cathedral, the city cathedral, and the National Bank. So it's at the apex, or the intersection of the seat of executive power, religious power, and economic power. These three forces that were colluding with each other during the dictatorship, okay? So first the mothers go there and they're just standing still and demanding to see their children, to know what happened to their children. But then the police told them they couldn't stand still, so they started marching or walking in a circle around that central column. And then they decided they're not going to call it walking because they have a purpose. They're going somewhere. So they started calling it marching because they wanted to highlight that purpose that they had behind it. The number of mothers, of course, began to grow. If the police demanded papers from any of them, then all of them would rush over and demand that he take all of their papers. Yeah, so they were really rallying together and supporting each other in their protests. Some of them were disappeared themselves, but the biggest strategy that the military used against them was just to call them las locas, the crazy ladies, yeah? To make them seem like, oh, they're nothing, they're just these crazy women over there. They wore white scarves, as you can see. These are called pañuelos. They're actually not scarves, but baby diapers, cloth baby diapers, to highlight or emphasize their role as mothers. Throughout their existence, they continue to refuse to acknowledge the death of their children. Their motto is aparición con vida, which basically means bring them back alive. They were taken from us alive, we want them back alive. And the mothers still march today. Another related group that emerged are the abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, the grandmothers. These, of course, were also mothers who lost their children, but they were the ones who lost daughters who were pregnant. So they're also demanding the return of their grandchildren, and I'm going to talk more about them later, a very important group. So ultimately, the work of all of these civil society groups and others that I'm not mentioning started to dismantle the power of the junta, but the real linchpin was the Falkland Islands War, or the Malvinas War. Argentina, these are the Malvinas, or Falkland Islands down there, this little island group off the coast of Argentina. They are British territory, though the Argentinians claim them as their own. They continue to do so. The military invaded the Falkland Islands to reclaim them as Las Malvinas in April of 1982, and they had great public support for this. Even though they were perpetrating all of these atrocities, the public still was very excited about getting Las Malvinas back. They didn't think that Britain would react because it's so far away from the UK. They thought that they would just take it back and it would be a good populist move. They were very wrong. Margaret Thatcher sent the full might of the British Navy, and within 2 months, Argentina lost the war, and it completely destroyed confidence in the dictatorship. So after that, it was really only a matter of time before the junta had to step down. Democratic elections were held in October of 1983, and then Raúl Alfonsín, who you see here, was elected president and inaugurated on the 10th of December 1983, and this brought an end to the almost 7 years of dictatorship. Alfonsín began very quickly the first official governmental efforts to address the violence of the dictatorship. So first, he began his presidency with widespread support from the public, but the military was still a threat. They were still incredibly strong, right? So this threat of another coup was always present. But despite that fact, Alfonsín began this revolutionary strategy of what today we call transitional justice, but we didn't call it that then because it didn't exist. The Argentinians were just making it up as they went along. And that started with the first Truth Commission in history, the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, which was created 10 days after Alfonsín entered office. The report for the Truth Commission was released several months later in 1984, and this is when people started to understand the full weight of what had occurred. It told of the disappearance, torture, and murder of almost 9,000 individuals. Now we know that number to be higher. Today the figures are around 30,000 people disappeared, around 500 clandestine detention and torture centers around the country, around 500 children appropriated and kidnapped, roughly 40,000 people sent into exile, and hundreds of businesses co-opted and shut down by the regime. But even given the Truth Commission and its findings, the military still refused to drop their party line. And even today, there's this code of silence that exists in the military. And they for the most part, refuse to testify or present evidence about the crimes that were committed during this period. As I said, they still refer to it as a dirty war. But this wasn't just about truth. It was also about justice. In 1985, the Alfonsine government put the 9 top orchestrators of the crimes of the dictatorship on trial. You see the 9 of them here. This was the first time since the Nuremberg trials that a democratic government tried its own former leaders, and it was the first time in history that it was done completely domestically without international support. They made a deliberate decision at this point not to try the rank and file killers. It was only the architects. And the results of this are that Videla and Macera, who you saw the pictures of earlier, were given life in prison. 3 other people were given extended sentences, and 4 of them were acquitted. But after this trial, further justice seemed pretty impossible because there had been several new attempted military coups. One of them almost succeeded. And the political realities in this military threat led to a huge transformation away from these revolutionary measures of transitional justice to what is often referred to as Argentina's period of impunity. So, as I said before, this process of responding to and transforming resonant violence in Argentina was not a short one, and it also went through periods of moving forward and backwards. So this period of impunity really marks the biggest and longest step backward when it comes to the state's own measures for dealing with the past. This period of impunity was institutionalized through the passage of a few laws. The first was called the Law of Full Stop, which said basically that after a certain date, no more cases could be brought against any of the military perpetrators. This was followed by the Law of Due Obedience, which said that no one could be prosecuted if they were following orders. So these 2 laws together made it impossible to prosecute anyone else. And then this was made even stronger in 1990 when a new president, Carlos Menem, was elected. Menem was a guy who advocated for forgetting about the past completely and moving forward. He wanted to destroy all of the former clandestine detention centers. He just wanted us to forget about it and move on, right? And on Christmas Eve of 1990, right after he took office, he granted full presidential pardons to all participants in the dictatorship, and that included those who had already been tried and found guilty. So all of those who were in prison were released from prison and granted pardons. So the state during this period was totally absconding from its responsibility for the crimes of the past during the late 80s and all throughout the 90s. But that doesn't mean that ordinary citizens did, because particularly the family members of the victims and other civil society organizations began fighting for a return to justice, truth, and memory. Even during this period of impunity, forces outside of the government were working hard against this process of forgetting. The grandmothers kept searching for their grandchildren. The mothers kept marching. And in the same way that the grandmothers gave birth to the mothers and the mothers to the children, a new generation of activists also came of age during this period. And those are the children of the disappeared, who started to become young adults during this period of time. And they formed a group called Hijos, which in Spanish is sons or daughters, right? Sons and daughters. But it's an acronym here that stands for Sons and Daughters for Identity and Justice Against Forgetting and Silence. This was a group that was formed in the city of Cordoba by about 70 sons and daughters whose parents had been disappeared. It was formed in 1995, and within several months the group grew to include over 350 members and have branches in 14 cities around Argentina. They did a lot of things, but the biggest contribution they've made to Argentina and really to all of us is this unique form of public activism that they developed called the escrache. The escrache is this very specific protest movement that was responding to the lack of formal justice and punishment for the perpetrators of torture, detainment, and disappearance during the military dictatorship. It comes from the slang verb escrachar, which means to uncover or to bring something to light, and that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to point out all of the unpunished perpetrators living in Argentinian society, and since the state wasn't putting them in jail or declaring them guilty, they were going to make sure everyone knew where they lived and make their lives harder for them because that their secret would be out. They would issue what they called a condena social, or a social sentence against them in lieu of a formal legal sentence. The escraches were these loud, theatrical, spectacular events. They weren't angry, they were quite carnivalesque. They would start with hundreds or thousands of people meeting at one part in a park or something in a neighborhood, and then they would march through the streets with music and singing to the house of a perpetrator that they had decided upon. At the home, the music and the chanting would continue. Participants would mark the house with these brightly colored paint. They would throw paint bombs at the house to mark it as the house of a perpetrator. They would paint on the pavement in front of it things like, "Here hides a free genocidaire." And then the leaders of Hijos would deliver a speech that would articulate the crimes of the perpetrator and announce the social sentence that they were issuing against him. After all of this, then the participants would march away from the perpetrator's home, and they would leave the neighborhood and the neighbors to act upon that knowledge that they'd received. The escraches represent what I call a co-embodied practice. Co-embodied practices are these embodied acts that are performed by groups of people acting in concert towards some shared goal and in public space. Now, to be clear, co-embodied practices can be both positive and negative. For instance, we can think of genocide itself being a co-embodied practice of people acting out in public space towards a shared goal. But when they're used, when that shared goal is something positive, when it's about dealing with that resonant violence of the past, then it can really transform that violence. It has the potential to transform it into new forms of agency, new forms of political power, and that, I argue, is what the escrache is doing. The escrache was a deeply planned event. It didn't just happen spontaneously. It would begin like a month to a month and a half before the escrache, when Hijos would enter into the neighborhood where the perpetrator lived. They will have done lots of research on the perpetrator before this, so they really were sure that this person perpetrated crimes. They would get people together to paint murals and street art to announce Hijos is coming, there will be an escrache, and therefore you know that a perpetrator is living amongst you. This is one graffiti that they have of their main slogan, si no hay justicia, hay escrache. If there's no justice, there will be escrache. This is the promise of Hijos, that they will continue to make escraches until the state starts putting them on trial again. They would hand out these pamphlets to people on the street or put them in mailboxes, and the pamphlets would have the name of the perpetrator, his address, photo, phone number, and a list of all of the crimes that he perpetrated during the dictatorship. So everyone would know who this man was and what he had done. And they would also work with other groups. This is a group of street artists who would make street signs that look like official signs, but this one says, 100 meters from here is Ernesto Fremont Weber, genocidaire, and then his address. So here you can see them co-opting the language of the state through the street sign to do the job that the state wasn't doing, right? The ultimate goal of the escrache, as I said, was to rally the rest of the community to join them in issuing a social sentence. So what does this mean, a social sentence? Well, the best description I found is this one member of Hijos, Julieta, whose father, aunt, and uncle were all disappeared, and she explains it really eloquently, I think. She says, given the absence of a legal sentence, there must exist a social sentence. What we pursue is that the perpetrator's own house becomes his jail, that his own neighborhood and neighbors sentence him in the daily things in his daily life. The social sentence makes the baker decide not to sell him bread any longer, the taxi driver not to take him. We want him and his past to stop being a mystery to the neighborhood. So again, this idea of if there's no justice, there is escrache. Julieta is demonstrating here how the escrache was more than an act of protest. It was actually performing the act of judgment that the state was refusing to perform. And the escrache represented the issuing of a social sentence that must then be carried out by the people of the neighborhood. Because of this, the performance of the escrache was only the beginning of this much larger process that hijos didn't take a part in. This process of condemnation was left to those most directly affected by the presence of the perpetrator, his neighbors. So hijos was really drawing this line in the sand that divided the criminal from the rest of the community, and it was then up to the community to decide what they would do, whether they would remain on their own side of the line by carrying out this social sentence, or cross that line by continuing to ignore the unpunished crimes of the neighbor. This is also an example of a practice of transmission, where hijos is this example of this transmission, of intergenerational transmission of affect, of memory, of trauma. Of course, hijos is a direct byproduct of the mothers and the grandmothers and their embodied practices. But more importantly, maybe, this transmission of memory is what leads to the transformation of the negative emotional energy of that memory, that resonant violence. In the face of the damaging affective force of resonant violence, which operates to push people out of the public sphere, hijos represents a reversal of that force by refusing to break apart and experience the pain of intergenerational traumatic memory in silence and in isolation. This negative affective force is actually transformed into something else. And this sentiment was confirmed for me when I had one conversation, it was confirmed many times over, but in one conversation with one of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo named Tati Almeida, I asked her what moved her to political activism in the face of such pain from losing her own son. And she said, actually, that pain, that rage, what they did to us did not leave us with hate. No, we transformed it into love for our children and into a fight, a peaceful fight. So the co-embodied practices of the mothers and of the hijos do not just transmit the memory of a violent past, but they transform it into something altogether different, more positive, and potentially preventive of future violence. So hijos continued to make escraches against these former perpetrators into the early 2000s, but then they ultimately wouldn't have to continue the escraches for much longer. Things started to change in 2001 when there was a huge economic crisis. This led to complete dissatisfaction with the state, political chaos. There was, in a 1-week period, there were, I think, 5 different presidents in Argentina. But eventually, with less than a majority of the vote, Nestor Kirchner was elected president in 2003, and this ushered in a period of what is often referred to as justice in full, depending on your political stance, I guess. This is him with his wife, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who became president after his death. He brought about a radically different economic agenda, responding to the neoliberal economic policies that led to the crisis in 2001. He worked with the courts and he nullified the laws of full stop and of due obedience. He had the presidential pardons against the perpetrators declared unconstitutional, and this paved the way for reopening trials against the perpetrators, and those trials began in 2005. So today, Argentina engages the past actively with this 3-pronged approach of truth, justice, and memory. These are the 3 words that they use, not reconciliation, very purposefully. Over 1,000 perpetrators have been brought to trial, and over 500 of them have received sentences. There have been financial reparations given to victims and their families. The state's developed numerous policies to support victims' families, aside from financial mechanisms. There's a forensics team that continues to uncover the remains of the thousands of disappeared persons that are in the river, and they return them to the families. And then the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo have started, they were one of the first organizations or people to take advantage of new DNA technology. So very early on, they created a DNA bank where all of them gave blood, and anyone who was suspected of potentially being a child of a disappeared person, they could go and have their blood tested and find out if they were related to one of the grandmothers. And in this way, right now, 121 of the roughly 500 children have been now know their true identity and know about who their family is, their biological family. So all of these things have contributed to an active culture of memory in Argentina. All of these achievements I've mentioned, the trials, the reparations, the recovery of the appropriated children, are examples of what can happen in a society that actively recognizes and deals with past human rights violations. But the comprehensive work of confronting resonant violence is also visible in more symbolic practices that demonstrate how dedicated people can ensure that the past remains active in the present so that it prevents the return of such violence in the future. So I'm going to talk about one final practice, and then we'll end and maybe have some time for questions. This is ESMA, which I mentioned was the largest detention and torture center during the dictatorship. And very importantly, in 2004, President Kirchner took ESMA back from the military, which still owned it. He, in a really important moment, took down this portrait of Videla, the first president of the military junta, and he declared the site a space of memory and opened its gates to the public, and people flooded in on that day and have continued to flood in since. Today, this site, which is a huge site, it contains over 30 buildings, it's spread over 42 acres, has been transformed as a means not only of remembering the past, but also of promoting an active culture of memory and human rights in Argentina. So, for instance, you can tour the officers' headquarters. This is the one building in the complex that was actually used for torture and detainment of prisoners, and that's been well preserved and is a place where people go to see the site of atrocity itself. But they had to figure out what to do with the other buildings in the complex. So this is a cultural center that was constructed out of one of the buildings. This is a place where people can go for free to see theatrical performances, art exhibitions, concerts, dance performances, academic conferences. There's a bookstore and a coffee shop so people can go and just talk to each other. All of the events there are free. All of them have something to do with the past, with memory, and it's really contributed to making this space a place of life rather than a space of only death. This is one of the art exhibitions that was there a couple of years ago. All of the other buildings they gave to civil society organizations and human rights groups that were working for the promotion of human rights or for memory. This is the National Memory Archive, which houses testimony and documents about the violence that happened during the dictatorship. This is a space that was given to the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo that they use as an after-school site for kids to teach them about human rights and memory about the past. And then I want to end by talking about one final practice that I found particularly inspiring that came out of this space. One of the organizations housed within ESMA hosted this particularly vibrant group-embodied practice in 2008. 2008 was the 30th anniversary of the 1978 World Cup final, which was played at River Plate Stadium next door to ESMA, just like a few minutes walk away from ESMA. So while the dictatorship was happening, all of the world was watching the World Cup match in Argentina, which the dictatorship was really using as a way of distracting the world's attention from the violence they were perpetrating. So as this World Cup match was happening, in which Argentina won the World Cup in the final, the prisoners in ESMA reported, some of them who survived reported hearing the cheers from the stadium. That's how close it was. So in response to this historic event and in honor of the disappeared, this one group, the Instituto Espacio para la Memoria, hosted what they called the Other Final, a match for life and for human rights. This was a symbolic soccer match to remember the 30,000 disappeared on the 30th anniversary. Thousands of people gathered at ESMA, including lots of the mothers and grandmothers and hijos. They unfurled this banner with the pictures of all of the known disappeared, and it spread across several city blocks. And then they carried it out of ESMA to the stadium, where they were joined by many other people and groups. A large section of the stadium was left empty in honor of the 30,000 disappeared people who couldn't be there, as well as the box seats where the military junta sat during the final. That was also left empty as a sign of condemnation. Two teams played an exhibition match against each other. The teams were formed by a variety of players, including 3 players from the 1978 national team, ex-political prisoners and detainees, children of several family members that went into exile during the dictatorship, and also the National Youth League. The match was broadcast live on TV. It ended in a 1-1 tie, and afterwards there was a concert with several well-known and well-respected musicians there. So this mixing of pain of the past with the joy of Argentina's national pastime, many people reported it as being an experience that they described as an exorcism of some of those demons of the past. I'm going to end by calling on another voice and another medium for conveying the story of Argentina. When participants of this final match, the other final, entered the stadium, this musician, Argentinian musician Daniel Viglietti, was playing a song, the lyrics of which came from an Uruguayan poet named Circe Maya. The song is called Otra Voz Canta, or Another Voice Sings, or is singing. And it's a song about the disappeared. So I just want to play that for you, and the lyrics are translated on the screen.
Detrás de mi voz, escucha, escucha, otra voz canta, viene de atrás, de lejos, viene de sepultadas bocas y canta. Dicen que no están muertos, escúchalos, escucha. Mientras se alza la voz que los recuerda y canta, escucha, escucha, otra voz canta. Dicen que ahora viven en tu mirada, sosténlos con tus ojos, con tus palabras, sosténlos con tu vida, que no se pierdan, que no se caigan, escucha, escucha, otra voz canta. No son solo memoria, son vida abierta, continua y ancha, son camino que empieza. Cantan conmigo, conmigo cantan. Dicen que no están muertos, escúchalos, escucha. Mientras se alza la voz que los recuerda y canta. Cantan conmigo, conmigo cantan. No son solo memoria, son vida abierta, son camino que empieza y que nos llama. Cantan conmigo, conmigo cantan, cantan conmigo, conmigo cantan, cantan conmigo, conmigo cantan.
This song, which is written as a tribute to the disappeared, stresses that the dead are not dead at all. Their voices call out, saying that they're still alive, that they have not been lost. Similarly, La Otra Final, the other final, is an example of a practice that re-embodies the disappeared, making them present, both through highlighting their absence through that empty stands that were reserved for them, and by symbolically carrying them out of the place of their torture and death to a place of joy. They were unable to celebrate with their countrymen as their team won the World Cup championship, but now there's another final being played, just like there's another voice singing. And this one is especially for them. This staging of conflicting emotions serves as a means for transforming the resonant violence of the past into the productive force of a collective stand against such violence in the present, through a collective embodied practice. A spectacular display of joy and commitment, a place with a troubling history is expunged of its guilt, its dirty past. It again becomes a place for community and passionate living. In other words, participants convert the enduring effects of resonant violence into new and vibrant sources of power and agency. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I'm sure people have many questions. Yes, okay, already one. I'm going to bring this over so for the video, so your question can be heard. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. My first question is, so that I can understand, what is the difference between political crimes of a government against its own people and genocide?
Well, I think genocide is an example of political crimes of a government committed against its own people.
Thank you.
I mean, one of the biggest debates in genocide studies and politics is how do we define genocide? What's the definition? As I said, this is not considered a genocide by the legal definition because political groups are not one of the protected classes of people. I think of it as a genocide because it was about the destruction of a group. And for me, genocide is characterized by the attempt to destroy a group. So that's why I consider this a genocide. There are types of political violence, what Scott Strauss would call mass categorical violence, where huge sectors of society are being killed because they're political opponents, but there's not the intent to destroy them completely. In Argentina, I think there's lots of evidence that the attempt was to destroy them completely, whether by killing them or making them no longer parts of that political group that would oppose the regime. So it's another form of destroying the group, I think.
Okay, thank you. And the other, actually my question next is related to what you just said. We saw that they were actually just rounding people up randomly, whether they were part of an insurgent group or not, even if they were merely suspected them because of the way they dressed or because of something a neighbor might have said against them. So it leads me to believe that it was really it was a fascist government committing crime against its own people and using the excuse of insurgency, but not really targeting a specific group. So my next question would be...
Let me just say, they were targeting a specific group of political opponents to the regime.
It
wasn't random.
And yet, but they were arresting people whether they had anything on them or not, you know, whether they had, whether they knew for sure they were insurgents or not. They were arresting them based on suspicion.
Yes, suspicion that they were part of the insurgent group.
Okay.
Yes.
And so then, was there a specific ethnic or indigenous group that they were also targeting?
During this period, there's some evidence that Jews who were disappeared faced stronger or more violent forms of torture in the detention centers. This is new research that's being done in the last couple years. Argentina has a long history of perpetrating violence against indigenous populations too. Right now, there's not a very big indigenous population remaining in Argentina because they were so successful at perpetrating that violence during the colonial period and after. But during this period, it was really focused on political groups, political opponents.
Okay. And finally, were there any repercussions or has the U.S. actually in some way been held accountable for their role in perpetrating these crimes?
No. In fact, they still, one of the big things that Argentina is trying to get the U.S. to do is release the classified documents that demonstrate U.S. involvement, and the U.S. continues to refuse to do that. And President Obama was in Argentina on the anniversary of the military coup earlier this year, and very sadly, he didn't offer any sort of apology or anything. It was a missed opportunity, I think.
I'm just wondering, I assume that the current administration in Argentina is as democratic as it's ever been. So my question is about your research and because you're going back and forth. You've been doing this since when? What year?
I began research in Argentina in 2010.
So you've been doing it for 5 or 6 years. Mm-hmm. What is the reaction of the government to your research?
Okay, so there's been a government change as of last year. Before that, the Kirchner government, which was both him and his wife, they're the ones who led the charge about memory relating to the past and putting the perpetrators back on trial. So that government was incredibly open to research and information and memory processes related to the past. So in fact, a lot of the groups, the mothers, grandmothers, and hijos, are now politicians in Argentina because they've gained that much influence within Argentinian society. The new president, Mauricio Macri, was inaugurated last December. He is not a Peronist, and he is much less apt to dealing with the past. He's more of the Carlos Menem, let's forget about the past and move on sentiment. And this is represented really in a tone-deaf, I think, shift where for many years since the dictatorship ended, there haven't been any public military parades. And the first military parade since 1983 happened under Macri earlier this year. So that was something that really scared people, that that public display of military might was happening again in the streets. So, but it's still pretty new. He's only been in office for a year, so we don't know what's going to happen, and we also don't know if he's going to stay in office after one term. So, yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the public and governmental reaction to the hijos, sort of at the time that they were active.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was very divisive because there were people who loved hijos and the escraches and what they were doing and thought they were excited about bringing attention to these unpunished perpetrators living amongst the people of Argentina. And there were plenty of people, and there still are today, who would rather forget about the past and move forward, and saw what hijos was doing as disruptive. I mean, these crazy young people who don't understand, how things work. They weren't a lot of the sentiments. They weren't alive. They don't really remember the violence of the past, even though they were alive because their parents were disappeared. But they don't remember the violence of the past. So why should they be the ones to carry forward this message? So it was a very divisive movement, and a lot of people don't like the escraches because they see it as a sort of violent act, especially the vandalism of property. But in all of my research working with hijos, I haven't found one example of any physical violence that erupted during the escraches. They were actually very positive, celebratory events. They always talk about them as being like a carnival or a theatrical fest party that they were throwing.
Can I ask a follow-up to
Yeah.
that then? I'm sure for everyone involved it was the carnival, and it's really cool movement. But there's a part of me that also feels like it's a little bit lynch mobby.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Yeah, this
and
is the
you seem
critique.
very enthusiastic about it, but I'm saying, like, isn't there a middle ground? There has to be people who... Okay, yes, there's people who oppose it because they don't want the past uncovered or because they're very conservative, but there's also an element to this that... I mean, you said they're absolutely sure these people committed crimes, but in some ways what they're doing is not actually justice. It's lynch mobby. There's no,
Well, okay. I guess the reason I understand the point. A lynch mob ends with a lynching, and there was they weren't. They were bringing to light something that had been swept under the rug. These people were living in the public eye, like in public space, and no one knew in most cases that they had perpetrated any crimes during the dictatorship. So it was about giving that information to people so that they could make their own decisions about what to do with that information. And like I said, they didn't physically hurt anyone. There was no, also they stayed true to their promise. When the trials started, they stopped doing the escraches. What they wanted the whole time was the government to do the job that it was supposed to be doing to begin with, to perpetrate people, or to prosecute people who had committed crimes. The state wasn't doing that, so they needed to create a very visible environment or action that would draw people's attention, that would anger some people. They wanted this to provoke action on the part of the state. So I think that's why I see, if it had become violent, I would be much more critical of it. But the fact that it never turned to violence makes me feel, I sort of like it.
Yeah, no, I think in theory it's fantastic, and I love the performative element of it and the idea of it. I just got a little...
Yeah. You're not alone.
Thanks. How specific is this process that you're tracing and explaining to Argentina in terms of its preventive potential. And I'm thinking specifically about societies who have histories of conflict and mass violence between different ethno-national or ethno-religious groups, where processes of justice are much more divisive, right, than what you describe even concerning this process, and where there is much less consensus about processes of uncovering and bringing to light, and also about this issue of memory, which is a major part in Argentina. But we know if you think about the paradigmatic case, right, Nazi Germany. And memory in Germany today, which is all over the country, and its landscape and urbanscape and architecture and formally at least education system and everything, by no means this has reduced the level of xenophobia and the potential of, it hasn't made the resonant violence disappear at all or even reduced in intensity, arguably.
Okay, I would argue that.
Okay. So how specific is this to Argentina?
Oh, I think it's totally specific to Argentina. I think every cultural context has to have its own process, and this is very Argentinian. I think the escrache could only emerge out of the Argentinian social and cultural context. Just like I think the power of the mothers is something that, there were mothers groups all over Latin America, but I think the way that they did what they did, it was responding to the specific cultural restrictions that were being put on them in the case of violence there. So I think I'm not a person who thinks that there's any right or wrong way or specific way of dealing with the past that needs to happen. I think it's always culturally specific. And I also don't know that putting everyone on trial is always the right thing. Like we can look at other cases of genocide where so many people were involved in the perpetration of genocide. We can think about Rwanda, for instance, where if you put everyone on trial, it overwhelms the justice system and just the philosophical view of what justice is, right? Like you just can't do it all the time. So it always has to respond to the cultural specifics. I agree with you that memory is so present in Germany now, memory of the Holocaust. I don't know that it's led to nothing. I think that's hard to say because we don't have the negative case of that, where what would Germany look like right now if that memory didn't exist? I think, for me, the fact that Germany is the one country in Europe that's accepting Syrian refugees, I believe that has something to do with the memory of the refugees that were created by German violence during the period of Nazi Germany. I don't think that's such a far-fetched idea. So I don't think it's led to. I don't think it means that xenophobia has disappeared, anti-Semitism has disappeared. Just like in Argentina, military sympathy with the military and people who still believe that violence was justified, that hasn't disappeared either. But it has led to some really positive, to the promotion of human rights overall. Yeah, it's hard, again, because we don't have a negative case.
Actually, I was going to say, yeah, I think Couldn't you consider Turkey as a negative case? With the Armenian genocide?
Yeah, of course.
And then if you compare Germany's behavior, you can see some type of progress being made based on the things that they've done memory-wise,
right,
arguably in comparison.
Yeah, but again, it's really hard because then there are also the cultural specifics of Turkey versus Germany, which are totally culturally specific in different places, right? So it's really hard. There's this big move lately because David Reef published this book in praise of forgetting. So there's now this big fashionable move of saying, oh, we have so much focus on memory that maybe we should think more about forgetting because memory of the past is often what leads to conflict. I really don't like this idea, mostly because I just think it's ridiculous. Memory can be a good thing, memory can be a bad thing, but memory is. And trying to pretend that people who have lived through large-scale violence are just going to be able to forget it is crazy. That's not possible. So we have to deal with it in some way.
And every memory already presupposes a forgetting. There's never not a forgetting. It's ridiculous.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Other questions? We are out of time, basically, but I think we could take one more question. If someone, yeah, you have a question. Wonderful, super.
Would you say Argentina had any Nazi influence? Because I know they were very open to accepting fleeing Nazis after World War II.
Yes, absolutely did.
Do you think any of them were indirectly or directly involved with this? Do you think maybe like consulting or just had some form of their hand in there?
I don't know how much people, or if people were consulting, but not, I mean, Argentina's a fascinating place because they accepted a lot of Nazi war criminals, but also a lot of Jewish refugees. So Buenos Aires is a city where you've got, and Argentina in general is a city where you've got a very large Jewish population and a very large German population all living next to each other. I think that these Nazi war criminals would fit in very well with the sort of authoritarian bent of the military, and the respect for the military during and before the dictatorship. So, but I don't know what research has been done about the exact influence of Nazi war criminals or involvement in the perpetration of violence during this period.
Just because when you were talking about how the beginning of it seemed very similar to when Hitler came to rise with the how you dress, the books and all that stuff, all the influences. It seemed very similar.
Yeah.
That's a great question, and it points out the value of comparative genocide studies, really, right, in terms of identifying these red flags and these patterns that go on. And I think it is true. We can see in history that genociders learn from one another, right, either directly or indirectly. They're aware of other techniques, and then they use them and adapt them to their own context. So I think that's a really great question. Any last questions before we? Yes, I know. There's so much to talk about. I knew there were. Sorry, I'm keeping everybody late.
Thank you. One of the videos I use in my government and politics class is a short video about the children that have gotten DNA tests and have renounced their parents that were their abductors, basically. There seems to be like I don't know how widespread this is among the children, but can you speak to like how the sense I got was like there were just like so much anger against their adoptive parents, but is that like a typical of reaction of the children who were kidnapped, or is there like a mix of all kinds of feelings?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a total mix. I've spoken and heard from these children who have discovered, and these children, of course, are now in their mid-30s, who have discovered that the people who they thought were their parents their whole lives are not their actual biological parents. Some of them end up totally renouncing their adoptive family and and start only associating with their biological family who they've just met. Others of them can't give up the idea of being raised, that their family that they were raised with is their family, and they sort of reject their biological family and don't have any association with them. And more commonly, they're somewhere in between. They can't forget these people that they were calling mom and dad their whole life, and brothers and sisters, right? The brothers and sisters, of course, who had nothing to do with it, right? But they also have a desire to have some sort of connection with their biological family, especially these grandmothers who have been searching for them and making such an effort to find them for so many years. It's very complicated. I can't imagine being in their shoes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, will everybody join me in thanking Dr. Whigham for coming?
Thank you. Thanks for having me.